Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. In our panel symposium today, we are featuring Dr. Ori Z. Soltis, who will be speaking about the Druze and the Kurds, two complex models in a complex region. Dr. Ori Z. Soltis teaches in Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization across disciplines, from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. He is the former director and curator of the B'nai B'rith Klutznik National Jewish Museum and has curated more than 90 exhibitions there and in other venues across the country and overseas. He is the author of over 300 articles, exhibition catalogs, and essays on diverse topics. Among his recent books are Our Sacred Signs, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draws from the Same Source, Searching for Oneness, Mysticism in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Untangling the Web, Why the Middle East is a Mess and Always Has Been, Growing Up Jewish in India, Synagogues, Customs, and Communities from the Bene Israel to the Art of Sayona Benjamin, God and Goalposts, A Brief History of Sports, Religion, Politics, War, and Art, and Identity, Art, and Migration. Without taking any further time, I would like to welcome Dr. Soltis, and I hope you enjoy this wonderful, enchanting talk.
Thank you so very much, Hirad. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it was a great pleasure to work for a couple of weeks at the Library of Congress researching. The Middle East is a complex and complicated place, to say the least. The very terminology. Do we call it Middle East? Do we call it Near East? Do we call it Southwest Asia? Or its geopolitical parameters? Google Middle East, and you'll find a half a dozen at least different versions and visions of what actually constitutes the Middle East, which countries get left in, which countries get left out. Part of that will depend on whether the map was made yesterday or 20 years ago. Part of it will depend on, well, whatever the map maker thought was correct. It's a region that is a complex interweave. It's a tangle of religion, politics, ethnicity, nationality, economics, all of which are interwoven with very often difficult to grasp definitions, conflicting and competing aspirations, and constant interferences from the outside. And this is a reality that has been in place for thousands of years, not dozens or a few hundred years, but thousands of years. Consider for a moment, for example, Semite, Arab, Muslim, Jew, Christian, Israeli, Palestinian. All of those terms are terms that are complicated, complex, and which typically when we use them, we don't think about with respect to their complexities, but are complicated of definition. Take just one of them, Arab, for example. When we use that term, do we mean it, and we can, to refer to an idea that has a geographic beginning? So I call myself an Arab because my ancestors, or I directly, come from the Arab, from the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Is it connected to my sense of ethnic self? And how can that be measured? So I am called, let us say, a Semite. Why? Because I'm speaking Arabic, which is a Semitic language. So actually, I'm defining myself by way of language. Or is it a matter of culture? Is it something to do with nomadic rather than stationary? The first mentions that seem to be of the Arabs, for example, on an Assyrian inscription from Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king, Shalmaneser III from 853, talks about Gindibi Arabi, and there's an Achaemenid Persian inscription from 570 that says Arabia, and both of those refer to outside groups that are nomadic and not part of the urbanized reality of the Assyrians and the Achaemenid Persians. Aeschylus, the Greek playwright at the beginning of the 5th pre-Christian century, in his play The Persians, mentions a character who is called Magos Arabos as a commander in the army of the Persian Shah Xerxes. And he is clearly someone, again, from the outside, from the wilderness, from the desert, from somewhere away from wherever we are. So it's a term which has a number of possibilities for understanding and for definition. If I think of the word as it was in use just prior to when Muhammad hit the scene in the late 6th, early 7th century, the word Arab referred to a kind of country bumpkin, someone who was nomadic, someone who did not live in the city and who was probably not particularly well educated. After the Prophet Muhammad, because eventually the Quran, which is the text of the new faith that he is shaping, Islam, is written in Arabic, the understanding of what the word means, the handling of what the language is about, becomes significantly elevated. And of course, if one turns to the modern era and one thinks of the Arab world in political terms, we're talking about a reality that extends across North Africa, from Morocco to Egypt, and from Egypt, of course, all the way to the gates of Iran. I might mention in passing that Abdel Gamal Nasser, the head of Egypt at one point, felt that Egypt was the center of the Arab world. And his successor, Anwar Sadat, when he made peace with the Israelis at the end of the 70s, one of the comments he made was, we Egyptians shouldn't be fighting all these wars on behalf of those Arabs. So two different Egyptian leaders, one who saw Egypt as essentially Arab and one who saw Egypt as not Arab. So Arab is a complicated term. So is Semite, so is Muslim, so is Christian, so is Jew, so is Israeli, so is Palestinian, and so are the terms Druze and Kurd, which I've chosen to focus on in my research at the library and this afternoon, because they are each so complicated that they offer microcosms of Middle Eastern complexity, and because both the Druze and the Kurds are minorities within a much different majority, and therefore offer potential models, at least to think about, of how one finds one's way in that region as a minority among majorities. The Druze, for example, to begin with them, were thought of by some of the 19th century anthropological investigators as having derived from the Persians or from the Gauls up in France, or even being a consequence of the Crusaders' arrival, the time they spent in the region, and presumably the intermarriage with natives that they brought about, and so on. And yet the Druze, as far as we can tell from other measures, clearly are indigenous and would fall under that umbrella that we call Arab, that umbrella that we call Semite, and umbrellas that they do and don't fall under will be very interesting to consider. There are all told maybe 600,000 Druze. We're not talking about a lot of people. And they, for the most part, inhabit the area of northern Israel, the Galilee, southern Lebanon, and southwestern Syria. So they are also found within 3 different countries according to today's geopolitical configuration of the region. They originated in the 11th century as a new faith tradition that is inspired by the 6th Fatimid Caliph, Al-Hakim, and the Fatimids are Ismaili Shi'i Muslims. So they start out as a subset of a subset of a subset of Islam. The key propagators of this new faith are Hamza ibn Ali, and initially Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Darasi. The interesting thing is that al-Darasi in the long run comes to be viewed by most as heretical, and therefore it's ironic for most of those whom we outsiders call Druze, though we call them Druze named for Darasi, because in fact, he's not regarded as a proper Druze. And so that's not the term that Druze use. They call themselves rather Madhab al-Tawhid, which is to say the sect of Unitarianism, of singularity, or more simply Muwahidun, which is another Arabic way of saying they are absolute Unitarians, because the central issue of their faith as they present it to the world is the certainty and absoluteness of the singularity of God. Al-Hakim disappears in 1021. And there are those within the Druze community, within the Muwahidun community, who believe that it's an occultation, that he is withdrawn from the world, a kind of self-exile from the world, until such time as the world starts to more effectively follow the teachings that he laid out and become a more ethical and moral and more perfect place. And he will reappear at a certain point to complete that process of perfection. Well, it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. And ultimately, the sense of occultation is one that is reserved for the end of time as we know it. There are others, by the way, who assumed rather that he was murdered. Any number of candidates to have been his murderer, including his sister, who was 16 years his senior, because he was so sui generis, so unusual, so different as a caliph. There were those who just thought, nah, this guy's a little bit off, and perhaps members of his own family. So that's a possibility. What is more important is, in the aftermath of his death, his successor as a Fatimid caliph, al-Zahir, started within a few months to persecute his followers, his continuers of the shape that had him as a centerpiece and was articulated by Hamza and early on by Darazi and others. And they were out seeking converts to the new form of faith, but by 1043, that had all stopped. The gates, as the tradition has it, were closed. If you hadn't embraced the faith by then, end of story, you cannot become a member of the faith. You can only be born into it. You cannot convert into it. There's less than no missionary activity after 1043. And in fact, many went into hiding, no doubt because of the persecutions being affected by al-Zahra. And there are those who practiced what is called taqiyya. So they professed not to be members of this faith and only practice it behind closed doors. Or conversely, they felt that we don't want to talk about it because, you know, if by 1043 you haven't joined, you can't join because you won't be prepared for the spiritual course that is being laid out. Aside from al-Hakim and Hamza ibn Ali and al-Darazi, there are 5 other major and minor figures that give us a kind of founding hierarchy of 8 individuals. And the teachings that are conveyed are found in a series of 111 letters, epistles, called the Rasail al-Hikmah, the Epistles of Wisdom, that were organized into 6 books. About 30 of those letters are written by Hamza, signed, and most of them are written by another of the 8, a guy by the name of Bahya ad-Din. In any case, they're not compiled together in a kind of coherent text until the 15th century, when a fellow by the name of Jamil al-Tanuhi organized them and also added the commentary known as the Sharh. So by then we might say we have a kind of confirmed set of teachings, which, however, are accessible only to members of the faith. It's not just that one cannot convert in, one is not going to be instructed as to what the faith is about. We have by now a sense of that faith, of those teachings. We have access to enough of the epistles and the commentaries to get a sense. The first principle, as I mentioned a moment back, absolutely the singularity of God. But the thing about God's singularity is that also God is beyond our ability to comprehend. God's very name is ineffable. We cannot know really anything about God because God is sui generis itself and separate from, different from us. The word in Arabic that conveys that is the word lahut. And so what the tradition brings forth is a kind of paradox that because God cannot in any way, shape, or form be grasped, and therefore how can I effectively be a member of the faith? God therefore chooses at certain points in history to manifest itself in human form so that we have access by way of that human form. So the tradition is that the last of these manifestations was Al-Hakim. So put another way, Hakim is God personified. And yet understand this paradox should not be confused, let's say, with the paradox within Christianity of a triune God. where Jesus is both human and divine, Jesus is of the same substance as God, whereas Al-Hakim and those who preceded him as manifestations of God are not of the same substance because they are of human substance, and God is beyond substance. They're simply manifestations of God. There are 8 messengers, again, that word Rasul, prophetic figures from Adam to Hamza, who convey God's truth, again, culminating with Hamza as the key propagator of the faith of which Al-Hakim is the center figure. The beginning point, to repeat, is within a subset of a subset of a subset of Islam, a Shi'i subset, a Ismaili subset, a Fatimid subset of Islam, and yet it diverges significantly enough from Islam that it becomes its own sect. There is no obligation to the 5 prayers daily, which are obligatory to every Muslim. In fact, rituals and prayers are considered less significant than spiritual discipline and deeds. There is no fast during the month of Ramadan. There is no prescribed pilgrimage to Mecca, Medina, or anywhere else. There is no zakat, charity, as it is specifically prescribed among the 5 pillars of Islam. There are, however, 7 key principles of the faith. The first is to hold one's tongue, meaning to keep one's promises, to be sincere in what one says, to admit one's errors, things of that sort, to keep secrets. The second is to watch over one's brethren, so a sense of solidarity among fellow Unitarians, muwahideen. No idol worship, shirking the devil, shirking evil. So we have free choice to go in the positive or negative direction, and we are joined by the tradition to shirk the wrong direction. The 5th key principle is belief in, it's the central one that I've already articulated, in the uniqueness of God and the presence of God in our reality as Al-Hakim, as the last of the manifestations or revelations of God. It's interesting, the terminology incarnation is not used. It is manifestation or revelation. The 6th is to accept God's deeds regardless. So in Epistle 9, for example, there is a hypothetical. If God were to request that you kill your child, you do so without even questioning. And some of you may recognize that as an echo of what we get in Genesis 22, which underscores and reminds us that the new sect that is being shaped, while it draws in large part, in large measure from Islam, also, as I will repeat, draws from Judaism, from Christianity, from Zoroastrianism, and as I will say again later, Neoplatonism, and by way of Neoplatonism, the Platonic mode of thinking. It is very diverse in its accumulation of traditions that influence it. The 7th of the key principles is coming to terms with both the concealed and apparent divine decrees. In other words, I take whatever comes to me and I understand it as part of God's divine plan. The division of Druze society is roughly into 2 groups. There is what's called the Ukal. These are the wise ones, the ones who know esoteric things, the ones who are who understand what is called batin, the inner meaning of texts. And the Ukal, by the way, can include men and women. So there is no gender distinction with respect to this kind of hierarchy. And the Jahal are the simple people, everybody else. But if I'm a Jahal, if I'm part of the Jahal and I want to become part of the Ukal, it's accessible to me. I can seek that. And I can probably, if I behave myself properly, become that. So there is no inherent religious, spiritual hierarchy. It's no, I inherited from my father, and if I didn't, I can't become it. That sort of feature of society is not present for this. What one must do, what it is called upon to do, is to visit what is a very simply appointed prayer room. It's called a halwa. Every evening, if I'm interested in becoming part of the Ukal, and even if I'm not, I should probably visit it certainly on Thursday evenings, which is the main evening of gathering, and probably on Sunday evenings as well. And violations of religious and cultural norms will lead to the Ukal pronouncing a kind of anathema upon me, where I'm excluded from the gatherings. So we see a diversity of influences into what becomes its own sect, its own form of faith, its own religion. And we see socio-politically over time, to distinguish that from religiously, a succession of leading families. In the 11th through 15th century, it's the Tanuch family, from which Tanuchi, who organized the epistles into their definitive form and added the commentary, derives. By the 16th, 17th century, the Ma'an tribe has become predominant within the community. By the late 17th century, it's the Jihab family. And the whole thing, which had begun in Egypt, because Cairo was the capital of the Fatimid dynasty, that's where Al-Hakim operated from, that's where Al-Hamsa and Al-Darazi, all of them operated from that area, although they may not have originated in that area, that's where they operated from. As the faith began to spread while Al-Hakim was still alive, it made its way up to and established itself around Mount Lebanon in what is today Lebanon. There is a tradition as well that there were missionaries going south into Yemen, east to Iraq, and as far as India, that there were communities established there in India as well. In any case, by the 18th century, there was the beginnings of a migration from Mount Lebanon toward the Hauran Mountains in Syria, a function in large part of internal Druze conflicts, an issue I'll come back to in a few moments, because during this whole time, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, as we come into the middle period, you might say, of Druze history, the community is dealing not only internally with itself, but externally with a succession of powers. And by the 16th century, it's the Ottomans who have come to dominate the entire area. And it's within that context that we begin to see the internal Druze conflicts taking shape as the Yazbaki and the Arsalan clans against the Jumblat clans, and those internal conflicts continue to the present day. But at the same time, there are conflicts within the larger Ottoman world, so that, for example, there was a vicious struggle in 1841 between the Druze community in Lebanon and the Maronite Christian community that, again, underscores for us that the Druze are not Muslim, they're not Christian either, they're their own group. And meanwhile, they are trying to figure out how to work as a minority within the Ottoman regime, which for the most part tended to be benign with respect to autonomy of its minority religious and ethnic groups, provided, you know, they paid their taxes and were good citizens. But occasionally you would have sultans who were much more aggressive about wanting to control everything, whether it was religious or political. Meanwhile, of course, the Ottomans are gone in the course of World War I. And in their stead, there's another, we might say, outside power for sure, the French, who dominate in this area. The aftermath of World War I divides most of it between the victorious British and the victorious French. And while the British take command of the area that today encompasses Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Jordan, and Iraq, the area that today encompasses Syria and Lebanon is taken control of by the French. And in 1921, the French, in the process of reorganizing Greater Syria as Syria and Lebanon, establish a Druze council, so the Druze have official representation as a community within the overall administration by the French. In 1923, that starts to become problematic because there's a French leader there, a guy by the name of Captain Carbier, who becomes more and more an interferer in internal Druze affairs. And all of that leads ultimately to an armed conflict against the French by the Druze between 1925 and 1927. So it is not the case that the Druze are never militaristic if they need to be in order to protect their spiritual and cultural prerogatives. Conversely, if we jump to another decade, the period between 1936 and 1939, when not as much in Lebanon as in what is now Israel, Palestine, and Syria, there is an uprising against British control on the part of primarily the Muslim Palestinian Arab population against the British, against the Jewish settlement, the Yishuv. The Druze, for the most part, are not involved in that at all. So clearly, depending upon where they are, they may view differently where they fit as part of which culture among the groups of cultures that are operating in any given place. So we see in the midst of World War I and in the midst of World War II in 1941, where Vichy France and the Vichy French under Nazi control are up in opposition against the British and the Free French, we find that there are Druze on both sides. In the aftermath of World War II, by 1947, there is a civil war going on, which in part is a function of the larger picture of the desire on the part of different parties to remove the British and the French colonial presence from the region. So before the British leave, there are two Druze factions with respect to the Jews and the Muslims, who are the two primary groups at odds with each other and at odds with the British until they leave. And after the British have left, in the period between 1947 and 1949, which is the period that begins with the Israeli Declaration of Independence, follows with a war that involves Israel and half a dozen of her Arab neighbors, and culminates with the Rhodes Armistice agreements between those neighbors and Israel in 1949. In the midst of that 1.5 to 2 year period, the Druze find themselves asking, should we tie our fate to Arab nationalism, and therefore with these various newborn Arab countries oppose the coming into existence of Israel? Or should we tie our fate to the Yishuv, to the Jewish establishment there? And for the most part, those in what eventuated as Israel chose Israel. And those who were in Lebanon and Syria chose Lebanon and Syria. So after 1949, to be concise about it, you find the Druze as loyal parts of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, loyal populations. In fact, you find in Israel, the government trying to define, well, the Druze, how should they be treated? Should they be regarded simply as, quote, Arabs? And you already understand from what I said at the outset, that that term is impossibly difficult to define and probably a poor one to use, and yet it was used and we still use it all the time in an overly simple manner. Do they just fit into that? Can we see them as a community that will become part of the larger Israeli community and entitled to all the citizenship rights that Israelis want? Or do we have to isolate them? And ultimately, they prove themselves loyal. They become in Israel Israeli citizens. They serve in the Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli army, significantly in 1967, again in 1982 in Lebanon. And of course, that would provide some complications for them, because Druze on the Israeli side of the fence have cousins on the Syrian or the Lebanese side of the fence. And so they're kind of, to a certain extent, caught between the fire and the pot. They want to serve the Israelis. They are loyal Israelis. They consider themselves loyal Israelis. And yet they don't want to find themselves fighting against their own cousins who are on the other side of the fence, who are as loyal to Syria and Lebanon as the Israeli Druze are to Israel. One of the more interesting developments in this comes about at the end of the 70s and just before that 1982 conflict, where in December of 81, the Israelis pass a law that those up on the Golan Heights, which Israel had won from the Syrians in 1967, have the right to get Israeli identity cards. They won't become Israeli citizens because the Israelis have not taken over the Golan and made it part of Israel. But clearly in their minds, the Israelis' minds, there's a kind of step in that direction by offering Israel identity cards, in particular to the Druze living up on the Golan Heights. And the interesting thing is, in what has been referred to as an example of effective nonviolent resistance, for the most part, the Druze refuse. They're not interested because they are loyal Syrians, because the leadership of the Druze on the Golan Heights are loyal Syrians, and they threaten excommunication, religious excommunication, for those who turn to the Israeli choice of identity cards. And as a practical matter, because the Druze are very practical, what if Golan Heights are eventually returned to Syria, which of course remains a possibility, and back in the 80s was even more of a possibility in hope for eventual negotiations for peace between Israel and Syria. If we take on Israeli identity cards, will we be disadvantaged when the Golan Heights goes back to Syria? If we fast forward, in the interest of time, to 2011 and 12 in the Arab Spring, there we find the Druze, of course, most significant for the purpose of this discussion with respect to their presence in Syria, as opposed to Israel or Lebanon. And one might have expected a kind of knee-jerk support of the regime because Assad's regime tended and tends to be relatively lenient with minorities because Assad, the present Assad and his father, they all come from a minority religious group, the Alawite. So they are interested in cobbling together in a kind of an alliance of religious minorities against the danger to them ever present of a majority. But when everything broke apart with the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria, the Druze did not necessarily support the regime. Some did, some didn't. In Lebanon, the Druze leaders were very cautious about even saying things about Assad because who knew where things might go with respect to the relationship between Syria and Lebanon. In both cases, it was more common to see a kind of neutral perspective and a diverse perspective of where we should go. There is a book written by Abu Izzeddin, Naila Abu Izzeddin, called The Druze, a new study of their history, faith, and society. And it quotes a discussion from 1899. The book dates from 1984, but it quotes a discussion in 1899 by German archaeologist Max von Oppenheim, who related, and now I'm quoting, the story of their origins as he heard it from a Druze authority, namely, that they are a sort of Arab stock with a small admixture of Kurdish blood. It remains to be stressed that the Druze are Arab by culture. They pronounce correctly th and the Arabic letters, and in particular th and ra correctly. So this question and this discussion from 1899 to 1984 of exactly what they are remains a very vital one, and obviously has a broad and deep range of directions in which one might take it in looking for an answer to the question. But the suggestion that they might be in part Kurdish brings me to the whole question of the Kurds. And my starting point with that question, because the last comment that I quoted had to do with the Druze pronunciation of Arabic that confirms that they are Arabs, my starting point with the Kurds is Kurdish languages. The Kurdish languages are understood to be a branch of Iranic, which is part of Indo-Iranian, which is part of Indo-European, which means they're related linguistically to Persian, but there is more than one Kurdish language. There are two main dialects, which are really sufficiently mutually unintelligible that we can call them two main languages, Kurmanji and Sorani. Most of the Kurds in Turkey, Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a few Kurds in northern Iraq and Iran, in the northwest and the northeast, about 15 to 17 million speakers Kurmanji. Sorani, on the other hand, 6 to 7 million speakers, and Sorani developed its own alphabet from the Arabic script, whereas Kurmanji uses most of the texts that are written in Kurmanji use the Hawar alphabet, which is derived from the Latin alphabet that we use for English. And actually in Iraq, Kurmanji became an official language together with Arabic under Saddam, of all things. Think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century, where eventually by 1861, German and Hungarian or Magyar were the two official languages of the empire. So like Magyar, the lesser in terms of numbers language to German, Kurmanji, the lesser to Arabic within Iraq. But then there is a whole third branch that are sometimes considered to be peripheral. The Zaza Gorani branch that includes Pelawani and includes Shwarin and includes Kurdali and includes Khwarani and so on and so forth. Some of these are non-Kurdish Northwestern Iranian language spoken by several million ethnic Kurds. So if I'm a Kurd, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a Kurd because I speak a Kurdish language. I could be a Kurd who doesn't speak a Kurdish language. And one might suppose that there could be non-Kurds who end up speaking Kurdish languages. In the Caucasus, there is a population of Kurds. that were once part of the USSR in Azerbaijan and in Georgia. And there were Kurdish speakers there, and there were Kurdish speakers as far afield as Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. But there were also there was also a case where there were Armenians who embraced the Islamic tradition carried by the Kurds. So they become Muslims and they become affiliated and involved with the Kurdish community. But ethnically, they're Armenians, they're not Kurdish. 10 to 20 million throughout Turkey, 2 to 3.5 million in Syria. In Iraq, 5.5 to 8.5 million. In Iran, 8.5 to 12 million. And scattered, some in Georgia, some in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, further afield, of course, Finland, the United States, Australia. The Kurdish community is a much more substantial one in terms of its population than the Druze community we have been discussing. But like the Druze, the Kurds end up in a number of different countries. The Druze, to repeat, essentially in Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. The Kurds, essentially in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And within the Kurdish community, there is a kind of social hierarchy, 4 classes. There are the Effendis, among whom there are educated individuals. There's a religious hierarchy, sheikhs, sayyids, and the like. There are tribal leaders. That's not the same as the other two. And there's the mass of tribesmen otherwise. And the emphasis on that word tribe, I will come back to in a few moments. In the 16th century, Sherafshan Bidlisi, who is the first kind of historiographer of the Kurds, talks about there being 4 groups, the Kurmans, the Lurs, the Kaykhurs, and the Zorans, each with its own language. And if we look once again to historical references, there are those who are certain they're derived from the Medes, who united with the Persians to create the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But earlier than that, the Assyrians mention the Kardu, which are presumed by many to be the ancestors of the Kurds. Xenophon, another Greek writer, at the end of the 5th, early part of the 4th century, talks about the Korduene, and there are others who talk about the Kurds. Most commonly, to repeat, they're assumed to derive from the Medes, who dominated what is now Iran in the mid-7th to the mid-6th pre-Christian century. They're first mentioned in the Pahlavi language in Sassanid Iran in the period between 224 and 651 CE. And the popular usage of the word seems to have arrived with the arrival into the Persian world of Islam in the 7th century. Arab and Persian authors tend to use the term to refer to all Iranian nomads from Western Persia. And we also find this disagreement as to whether the term Kurd even refers to an ethnicity or whether it's altogether a socioeconomic term. The root Kwrt in English spelling, Kwrt, that comes from Middle Persian tends to mean shepherd, nomad, tent dweller, any group with that sort of lifestyle. So again, it could be a matter of socioeconomics and culture, and it may or may not be a matter of ethnicity. Religiously speaking, most Kurds are Sunni Muslims. So the Druze, remember, derive from a subset of Shi'i Islam. Most Kurds are Sunni. They follow within Sunni, in the majority, the madhab or the school of Sharia that is called Shafi'i, and a significant minority follow Hanafi. So there are 4 major schools of Sharia within the Sunni form of Islam, and the Kurds are primarily found to be part of 2 of them. But there are also members of the Shafi'i madhab who became Sufis and who follow either the Naqshbandi or the Qadiriya tariqas, those movements within Sufi Islam. There are also Alevis. There are also Shi'is. There are also Yarsanis, who have their own distinct literature following a 14th century Sheikh by the name of Sultan Sahak. There are also Yazidis with their roots in pre-Zoroastrian thinking about one God with 7 angelic beings that guide the world. And there are also Zoroastrians. So Kurds, while they are for the most part Sunni Muslims, are in fact rather diverse in the different directions that their spiritual traditions have taken them. And it is fair to say that their tribal identity is, for the most part, until relatively recently, stronger than the Kurdish identity. More about which in a few moments, in fact, because if we think, first of all, of the cultural identity of the Kurds, what is it that we have to examine? And the obvious thing is, well, is their literature. And as we've said and seen, Kurdish languages use different writing systems, and historically there isn't per se a Kurdish writing system. So there isn't a simple way to say, oh, there's a Kurdish literature. So we have, for example, poets in the 10th century already, oral poets like Baba Tahir Hamadani, who wrote in the Lur dialect, which is also, by the way, considered a Persian dialect. But then coming into a significant development, poetry and language in the 15th through 18th century in what we would call the Kurdish area, we might call it Kurdistan. There is Ali Hariri in the late 15th century. There is Malaya Jaziri, there's Fatih Tehran. There's a whole group of important individuals, some of whom, for example, Ismail Bayazidi wrote poetry in Kurdish and wrote a Kurdish Persian Arabic dictionary, or Sharif Khan from the very end of the 17th into the early 18th century, who wrote in both Arabic and Persian. And there emerge in the 16th and 17th centuries two major literary works. One is the Sharafnama, which is, in brief, the history of Kurdish states and the developments of the emirates, written, however, in Persian. There is also Mamuzan, which is a poetic epic in Kurdish. There are a number of maybe 2 or 3 really important epics. The Persian language is written in Persian. Historical work on Kurdish dynasties, to repeat, is what is called the Sharafnama. And it was composed between 1596 and 1599 by Sharaf Khan Bidlisi, who was a prince of Bidlisi in northern Kurdistan, which today would be southeastern Turkey. His book consists of a preface, an introduction on the Kurds, 4 books that are devoted to various Kurdish dynasties, and a work of Ottoman history, annals, as a kind of conclusion. And it touches on the 3 main subgenres of Islamic history, historical writing rather, historiography, dynastic history, annalistic history, and local history, but it's doing that by way of a description of the Kurds. There is then the Kurdish Shahnama, the Book of Kings. In Kurdish, it would be called Shahnameh. And this refers to a group of poetic works that mainly tell the mythical history of Iran in a larger sense, the world from the first king until the end of the reign of Bahman, the last legendary Khayanid king. The Kurdish Shahnameh particularly focuses on tales of Rustam, who is the unique superhero and patron of Iran. And scholars believe that the Kurdish epic narratives significantly differ from others. For example, the most famous Shahnameh, which is the Persian work by Ferdowsi in form, language, and narrative structure, and it gets written down for the first time at the end of the 16th century. I mentioned the story of Mem Zin, which is a kind of Romeo and Juliet-like adaptation, which is considered the Kurdish national epic that was written by Ahmed Khani in 1692 and is written in Kurmanji, in classical Kurdish with many Persian and Arabic inclusions and references, because Khani wanted to prove that the Kurds were not uncivilized, bloodthirsty tribes, but have a literary tradition that produces high standard works. I'm quoting from the beginning of his beginning. So that people will not say that the Kurds have no knowledge and have no history, that all sorts of peoples have their books and only the Kurds are negligible. So there develops this rather wonderful literature with its different components in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. And a sense of Kurdish cultural identity is accordingly starting to take shape gradually in that period and as we move forward into the 18th and 19th centuries, although a real Kurdish nationalist movement won't really take place in development until the late 19th, early 20th century. If we look very briefly at what was happening to the Kurds within the larger world during this time period, the Seljuks are the first to establish what they call Kurdistan as an administrative district under Sultan Sinjar in the early half of the 12th century. I remind you that Saladin is the great Kurdish warrior who fought against the Crusaders and defeated them significantly at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin in 1187, and who put aside the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, creating his capital there of a new Ayyubid dynasty, but in the process became very Arabized in his culture and even in the language that he used. The Ottomans, of course, who overrun the whole region over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, established Kurdistan under Selim II at the beginning of the 16th century as a province. And that province was officially reestablished because it kind of disappeared in the middle of the 19th century in 1846 as part of reforms in the Ottoman Empire going on at that time. Over in Iran, what emerged in the post-Safavid era as the Qajar dynasty, which was founded in 1746 with the help of the Kurds, specifically the Ardalani Kurds, and there was a marriage between a Qajar son and an Ardalani daughter that helped affect this. Yet the Qajars ultimately eliminated the autonomy of the Kurds in 1867. And of course, the Safavids that preceded the Qajars and the Ottomans that were contemporary with both the Safavids and the Qajars, who were at odds with each other all the time, found the Kurds sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other side. And of course, the British entered the scene by the late 19th century, as do the Germans, as do the Russians. And in a series of conflicts, the first Russo-Turkish or Ottoman-Turkish war between 1828 and 1829, the Kurds were on the Russian side. They didn't like Mehmed II's centralizing policies that would limit Kurdish autonomy. They cooperated with the Russians in the Crimean War in the 1850s. They began to develop their own complex emirates with complex relations with the larger powers. In the 1870s, they were part of a revolt against the Qajars. They had struggles with the Armenians, and the process of all of this, and I am close to wrapping up my presentation, comes with the development of modern Kurdish nationalism in the late 19th century, the newspaper Kurdistan, which was published in both Kurmanji and Turkish. It was pro-Ottoman, by the way. Mamuzin, another publication in Kurdistan. There were Kurds who were part of the Young Turks group that overthrew Abdul Hamid II, the Ottoman Sultan, in 1908. And after World War I, the Kurds expected that they too would receive estates. It was discussed at Versailles. It was discussed in 1920 at Sèvres. It was discussed at Lausanne in 1923. Even Ataturk sought to attract the Kurds into his new state, but the British ultimately provided them with nothing. And in the period between World War I and our own time, the same principles, the same issues, the same ideas seem to play out again and again within the region. And that is that we find the Kurds subdivided among different polities, themselves having gained no polity, finding themselves caught between the Iraqis and the Turks at one point, assisting the Turks under pressure from the Americans against Kurds from Turkey, finding themselves assaulted by Saddam's army and his chemical warfare at the same time, and with the destruction of Iraq after the Second Persian Gulf War of 2003, for the first time, de facto, the Kurds established their own state, which didn't and doesn't mean that there were not still and don't continue to be internal conflicts among the different groups that we call Kurds. At one point, Assad grants autonomy to a Kurdish state in Syria, hoping that that will further their assist of him against those whom he's fighting to salvage his reign. And Iran, of course, is a complicated and difficult story in and of itself. The United States always supports the Kurds when we need them. And if we don't need them, it's interesting how easily our support of them has tended historically to evaporate. In the most recent debacle involving ISIS, where the Kurds were getting slaughtered because they had very little weaponry over and against what ISIS had found, when we provided them with weapons, it is they who turned the tide against ISIS and played an important role in the ongoing reshaping of the region. Both they and the Druze are complicated stories, microcosms of the larger complicated story of the region of the Middle East, and each with its own subset ways of dealing with the majority world around them.
Dr. Soltis, thank you very much for taking the time. I didn't want to stop you because I wanted you to wrap up both the Druze as well as the Kurds. Of course, this situation isn't unique to the Kurds. I have one question for you,
Sure.
Since we don't have that much time. And essentially, the Druze and the Kurds are there, but there are a number of other groups which you're familiar with. Among the Kurds, you have the Yazidis, Assyrian Christians, who actually, a number of them, a good chunk of them live among the Kurds and are minorities themselves. Of course, Assyrians live in many parts of the Middle East, Turkey and Arab countries as well, Syria, Lebanon. Also the Mandeans between Iran and Iraq, a very ancient population. So for all of these groups, and of course there's lots of politics involved in all of it, and of course religious and ethnicity, how can these groups, each of them, in some way be an instrument for understanding the complexity of religion and a religious perspective in this region?
Yes.
Or ethnicity for that reason, because as you know, even the ethnicity side of it is fairly complex.
Right.
Just among the Kurds, you have several subgroups, not to mention dialects.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So this comes to the very reason why, when I was given this opportunity to research at the library in this area of the Middle East, having something to do with religion, I thought, it would be very interesting to do the Druze and the Kurds. Because if one of my bêtes noires is that we have on the outside so little understanding of how incredibly complicated the region is. So if I were to be able to provide a study of each of these two groups that are so different from each other with certain overlapping principles, one primarily we think of in religious terms, and it turns out, well, it's not that simple. The other we think of in ethnic terms, it turns out it's not that simple. To offer these as models of complexity, that someone who reads about the Kurds and reads about the Druze, even just concisely with respect to these complexities, would not only realize, oh my goodness, there's so much I don't understand about these people that I didn't even know that I didn't know what I didn't know, that one could be inclined to then step back, widen the lens and realize, oh my goodness, what is it that I don't know about, the Palestinians, about the Yazidis, about the Turks, about the Iranians, any of these groups that succumb to so much complexity, all of which is so interweaving in a region of unbelievable complexity.
Absolutely. And I also want to quickly add that the Kurds also have a Jewish community that's quite interesting as well, who speak Aramaic, not Kurdish. So
exactly.
That's the language. The language and religion doesn't always, and as you said, many of the Kurdish dialects that you've noticed yourself are technically not Kurdish, like Zaza and Gorani. Some of the earliest Kurdish poetry is Gorani, which today Gorani is considered its own Iranic language. However, it's very, very fascinating. On the Druze, I'm also going to wrap up with this quick comment. What specifically with the current situation of the Druze drew you to focus on them as it relates now to the whole Syria, Lebanon, Israel situation? And where do you see the future for the Druze?
I mean, I see them as ideally, a potential buffer that could help be an instrument for bringing these three polities together. But what I was mainly first focused on was pointing out that typically when one hears about the Druze, I think in the United States, you hear about them in the Israel context, and everyone says, "Oh yes, they serve in the Israel Defense Forces." Da 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 da. And end of story. But it turns out not only are they elsewhere, but when the Israelis were really trying to force the Golan, formerly Syrian Druze, to become quasi-Israelis, they said no, because that's not what we are. So clearly there is much more nuance to their sense of identity, politically, nationally, and otherwise. But that could be a plus in a better world anyway, where because they've got cousins on all sides of all these fences, they could be part of the instrumentation of trying to have these larger entities, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, get to each other in a more positive way. That's a little bit perhaps overly idealistic on my part, but I'll settle for having people understand more about what they're about, even if it doesn't lead to the kind of outcome that I wish it could.
Absolutely. Again, I thank you very much. And I just want to say also with the Kurds that with the situation that they're in now, maybe they can be that bridge that you just mentioned.
Absolutely.
Because they're in Iran, they're in Turkey, in Iraq, and Syria. Culturally, they are closer to the Persian speaking, but they are definitely historically have close ties to the Ottoman and Arab world as well. So maybe like the Druze, these communities that are smaller, that sort of go between territories. Baluchistan is another one I'm thinking of, where they're in three different countries. These communities could be the future in some ways of bringing people together and superseding nationalism. Long and short, what do you hope that a study like this will give the audience so that people leave with some, anecdotes or some lessons from all of these situations and communities?
I guess for me, the name of the game is always the same. I want my audience, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's a book that I've written, or whether it's in this kind of a context, to go away thinking. And because I have as a concern that most of us, including within our government, don't spend enough time thinking about and trying to understand these things, so that we are more inclined to go in like the bull in the china shop, knocking things over because we don't understand what the value of what's going on in the china shop or how complex it is. My wish would be that someone who hears this or someone who reads this says, wow, really complicated. Maybe I have to rethink what I thought I knew about the region. That's it.
Thank you very much for taking the time. Your presentation on both the Druze and the Kurds was very fascinating. I frankly learned a lot. I appreciate it very much, and hope to see you visit us at the library and continue your research.
Thank you. I expect to.
Likewise. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.